When Ethan Thompson arrived at St. Bartholomew's Academy, he was less than thrilled. The centuries-old boarding school loomed over him, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard. The cold, gray sky matched his mood, sullen and heavy. Ethan's parents had insisted on sending him to this elite institution after a string of poor performances at his previous schools. It's a fresh start, they had said. But as Ethan looked up at the towering structure, with its stained glass windows and ivy-covered walls, he felt a sense of unease settle in the pit of his stomach. The headmaster, Mr. Grayson, was a tall, thin man with a gaunt face and sharp, penetrating eyes. He greeted Ethan with a firm handshake and a curt nod. "Welcome to St. Bartholomew's, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice as cold as the stone walls surrounding them. "I trust you will find our academy to be stimulating." Ethan managed a weak smile and followed Mr. Grayson through the dimly lit corridors. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking men and women, all former headmasters and headmistresses of the school. Their eyes seemed to follow Ethan as he walked past, sending a chill down his spine. "Your room is in the west wing, Mr. Grayson informed him as they ascended a grand staircase. "It's one of the older parts of the school. Some say it's haunted, but I wouldn't put much stock in such stories if I were you." Ethan glanced at the headmaster, unsure if he was joking. Mr. Grayson's expression remained unreadable. When they reached the west wing, Ethan was struck by how different it felt from the rest of the school. The air was colder, the shadows deeper. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, and the old chandeliers flickered as though struggling to stay lit. "This is your room, Mr. Grayson said, opening a heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. "I trust you will make yourself comfortable. Dinner is at 7 sharp in the Great Hall." Ethan stepped into the room, trying to suppress the growing sense of dread. The room was small, with a single bed, a wooden desk, and a wardrobe. The only window looked out over the sprawling grounds, which were shrouded in mist. As he unpacked his belongings, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned to the window but saw nothing but the fog pressing against the glass. Dismissing the unease's nerves, he decided to explore the school before dinner. The west wing was eerily silent as Ethan wandered through its narrow corridors. The old wooden doors, many of them sealed shut, bore brass plaques with names of former students. Some were so old the names were barely legible, the metal tarnished with age. At the end of one particularly dark corridor, Ethan noticed a door slightly ajar. Curious, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for an old mirror propped up against the far wall. The glass was cloudy, reflecting the dim light in a distorted manner. Ethan approached the mirror, peering into its murky depths. For a moment, he thought he saw something move behind him, a shadow flitting across the room. He spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. "It's just your imagination," he muttered to himself, turning back to the mirror. But as he looked into the glass again, his reflection seemed wrong. His eyes were darker, almost black, and his face appeared gaunt, hollowed out. Ethan stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. Shaken, he hurried out of the room, pulling the door shut behind him. That night, Ethan barely touched his dinner. The great hall was filled with the sound of clinking cutlery and the low murmur of conversation, but he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the mirror and the unsettling reflection he had seen. After dinner, Ethan retired to his room, hoping that a good night's sleep would ease his nerves. But as he lay in bed, the silence of the west wing pressed in on him. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside his window seemed amplified in the darkness. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by strange dreams. In one, he was walking through the corridors of the west wing, but they were different, warped, twisting endlessly. The doors were all open, and from each room came a soft whispering, like the rustle of dry leaves. He couldn't understand the words, but they filled him with a deep sense of dread. In another dream, he stood before the mirror again. This time, his reflection didn't match his movements. When he raised his hand, the reflection smiled, a slow, cruel grin that made Ethan's blood run cold. He woke in a cold sweat, the image of that twisted smile burned into his mind. As he lay there, trying to calm his racing heart, he heard something, a faint scratching sound, coming from behind the walls. Ethan held his breath, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, more insistent, like nails scraping against wood. Terrified, Ethan jumped out of bed and pressed his ear to the wall. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence. He stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, but the sound didn't return. The next day, Ethan was exhausted but determined to find out more about the West Wing. He spent the day in the library, poring over old records and journals, searching for any mention of strange occurrences in that part of the school. He found a dusty old book in the back of the library, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age. The title was barely legible, The Hauntings of St. Bartholomew's. Heart pounding, Ethan opened the book and began to read. The book told the story of a young student named Samuel Harker, who had attended St. Bartholomew's over a century ago. Samuel had been a quiet, withdrawn boy, often bullied by his classmates. One day, he disappeared without a trace. Despite a thorough search of the school and grounds, Samuel was never found. According to the book, strange things began happening in the West Wing shortly after Samuel's disappearance. Students reported hearing whispers in the halls, seeing shadows move on their own, and finding their belongings mysteriously rearranged. Some even claimed to have seen Samuel's ghost, his hollow eyes staring out from the darkness. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine as he read the accounts. The descriptions matched his own experiences too closely for comfort. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan decided to explore the West Wing more thoroughly that night. He waited until everyone was asleep before slipping out of his room and into the dark, silent corridors. Armed with a flashlight, he made his way to the room with the mirror. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty hall. The room was just as he had left it, the mirror leaning against the wall, its surface dull and lifeless. Taking a deep breath, Ethan approached the mirror. He stared into the glass, half expecting to see that twisted reflection again. But this time, the mirror showed only his pale, tired face. He was about to turn away when he noticed something strange. The reflection of the room in the mirror didn't match the real one. In the reflection, the door was closed, and there was something written on the wall behind him. Heart pounding, Ethan turned to look at the wall, but it was blank. He turned back to the mirror, and the writing was still there, scrawled in what looked like blood. The words were barely legible, but he could make out a single sentence: "Find me." A cold dread settled over Ethan as he realized what he had to do. The message was a plea, a cry for help from beyond the grave. Summoning all his courage, Ethan reached out and touched the mirror. The glass was cold, almost painfully so, and for a moment he thought he felt something pulling him, dragging him into the mirror's depths. He pulled his hand back, heart racing. But he knew he couldn't stop now. If there was any chance of helping Samuel, of putting his spirit to rest, he had to follow the clues. The next day, Ethan continued his research, this time focusing on the layout of the West Wing. He discovered that the wing had once been much larger, but part of it had collapsed in a fire many years ago. The ruins had been sealed off, forgotten by most of the school's inhabitants. Ethan was convinced that Samuel's body, or at least some clue to his fate, was hidden in those ruins. But getting there would be dangerous. The West Wing was already unstable, and venturing into the sealed-off area could be deadly. Despite the risks, Ethan knew he had to try. That night, he returned to the West Wing, this time with a crowbar he had borrowed from the maintenance shed. He made his way to the far end of the corridor, where the floorboards were warped and cracked from the damage. He pried open a loose board, revealing a dark, narrow passage leading down into the depths of the school. The air that wafted up was stale.